Hello guys and welcome to Strategic Command, World War II, World at War. Today, I'm going to be providing you a digestible, I hope, layman's unit guide. I've already read through the manual of this game several times and done my own playthroughs. I've used all except one unit type in the game, and so I'm going to go over with you while looking at the axis all the units here on the list, tell you what they do, what they're good for, and maybe suggest some tips on how to use them. I'm not going to be including all of the specific stats and modifiers because I want this to be digestible to a new player, and looking through the manual, I didn't deem that to be as easily digestible. So we're going to try to sum things up here. So to start, HQs, headquarters units. These are units where you are generally limited. Generally, with all units, you will be limited by build limits, which you can have soft caps instead, where it costs more to make units beyond the build limits, but you'll be limited not just by your build limits, but also by how talented of officers you can get, for example. There are different officers, and you'll have HQs start on the map, and they won't necessarily have your best officers in them. As you see, this is von Kukler, he's rating 6. However, Germany has von Manstein available at rating 9. And let's not forget Rommel, who's tied to an event. HQs, in game terms, exist to be buff units. These are like your supports. You can see these highlights around friendly units. It means that they are attached to an HQ. You can manually control that stuff or leave it on automatic. I find automatic to be far more approachable and easier. I still haven't figured out how manual even fully works. I find it to be very unresponsive. Attaching things like air units is very important for them to be able to operate efficiently. Land units receive a buff, but it's not as vital for them as it is for air units. And naval units just simply cannot be attached. Naval units don't have any HQ or equivalent. HQs do become more efficient with command and control research. Specifically, it lets them attach more units, it lets them move farther, and it raises their rating, which increases their buffs. So, very important. Also, if you place them on supply hubs, places supply come from, for example, Danzig, which produces 10 supply right here, they can buff supply, essentially, either from a point of origin or further down the line, and then help it spread to other units better, especially if you place them along a rail or a road. Very important unit there. Very complicated one to start out with, but HQs are a pretty core unit. They're one of the most expensive units, especially for land units, and they're just very, very important. Without HQs, you would not really succeed in this game. So they're very important to have, maintain, and protect, and place in the correct locations. They can make even the most inopportune desert offensives become successful with their ability to bounce supply and buff up units in the harshest of zones. Garrisons are the weakest infantry unit that there is. You can see one right here. They can only come in at half of any other unit's total strength number, and their stats are pretty pitiful. To view any stat, by the way, you can right-click it and go to properties if you already have them, or otherwise, when you are purchasing a unit, you could just click on that relevant unit and then see the stats right here. When looking at any unit's properties, you could see what target type that unit is, and you could see how good that unit will be at attacking that sort of target type and defending against it as well as some general stats up here. Garrisons are not meant for fighting, not meant for attacking, as you might think in the name garrison. It is for garrisoning. It can be used for garrisoning things of importance that you don't want the enemy to be able to snipe, such as a capital or national morale objectives, important locations that you don't think will be attacked, but you want to make absolutely sure. Or the way I tend to use them more actively is dealing with partisans. So if I take over France, for example, I don't want any partisan damage or full-on partisan units to rise. So by putting a garrison, for example, any unit, within one land hex range, so here counts for this, I can actually stop these partisan activities from happening, and that's probably the most useful thing to garrisoning. Garrisons could also be useful as an extra cheap way of defending things like Pacific Islands so that they're not fully undefended, but they won't last nearly as long in any fight as the next strongest unit, a corps, would. So, mostly for partisan activities if you ask me, but they can be used in defensive fixtures, but be very careful on relying on them for that. The next unit, being corps, is 3 times as expensive as a garrison, and this is the minimum unit you want defending any important location, if you ask me, and the minimum unit you want on the attack. They are better than the next thing, armies, in that they are faster because they are smaller. Being 100 MPPs cheaper than an army and generally more accessible with build limits, depending on nation as well, these are very important units to have supporting your stronger armies for maneuvers and being able to swap into defensive roles pretty easily without wasting offensive capacity as much while you wait on garrisons to come in and fill in the rear, for example. Armies are your heaviest infantry hitters. If you're going to be pushing an offensive with any infantry unit, it's going to be this one. Pretty wasteful to be using in defensive roles. These are the most expensive land infantry units you can really be going for that are general multi-purpose. It is notably slower than a corps, both of which can be upgraded with mobility eventually. And this could catch it up to being a corps, but here you have it. Despite its strength, it's pretty slow, and with insufficient weather and supply, that could, in some bad scenarios, means it's only moving 1 hex per turn. So, very good heavy hitter, not very good for maneuverability, flanking, or getting around enemies, but it's a pretty linear progression there with those 3. Next we have Mechanized. Technically mechanized infantry, but not really. The infantry can't get out, and they technically count as light armor. In this game, light armor is not actually light armor. It is a way to summarize what is effectively an outdated tank, so it's very weird that it gets put into that. But just like an army, it also has a full zone of control, as well as being pretty darn heavy hitting. If you take a look at those stats over there to the right, pretty darn heavy hitting. Even better against enemy armored units, but maybe worse at rooting out garrisons. It does benefit from certain research that can grant it a second attack. This is an even more offensive version of an army, but it costs just as much. The only downside is a simple defensive anti-tank unit will stop it in its tracks. This is a very good unit. You barely get any of them in the build limits, which is why they're so good. Just be very careful because they're easily countered by anything that can counter armor, and especially countered by it because they count as being the worst type of armor in the game. Moving on, we have Special Forces. These are your Marines. They cost a bit more than a corps and are a bit stronger than a corps, and still notably less than an army, but they are still notably weaker than an army. Their movement range is not as good as a corps, but they're not really intended for land-based fighting. Instead, they are intended for naval invasions. Heck, that's essentially entirely what they are based on. When doing naval invasions, any unit can get into a amphibious, long-range amphibious transport, for example, any land unit. However, they need to be next to a port and have enough supply to do this. Special Forces can do this from anywhere, and additionally, for example, if we look at an Operation Torch, if you land with an amphibious invasion here, you need to take important towns and whatnot, and ports to secure supply, because a corps or an army landing is going to drop down to whatever the local supply is within 1 turn. A Special Forces is going to start out at 10 supply and drop by 1 supply per turn until it gets to the local supply. So an amphibious invasion with normal infantry units can be potentially more expensive and more costly, and it really relies on securing supply or just fully succeeding in 1 turn, which is kind of what Operation Torch was. But if you look at Special Forces, they could land somewhere, like even right here, where there is no supply, and fight there for half a year, honestly, until they start getting in a more desperate position. And that's half a year that you have to take a location before the debuffs really start kicking in. That's a long time. So that's what your special forces are really good for. Engineers, quite expensive for what they are. You will not be using these in combat if you know what's good for you. These really exist with the sole purpose of setting up fortifications. For example, if we look over at China and turn off the unit filter, you'll see these fortifications. Engineers can set these up. There are some there at the start of a game. They'll just be on the map by default, but an engineer unit can also set one of these up anywhere that is generally empty, like not a town. This can be important and very useful if you're planning on defending something. However, they work very, very slowly. So this is a kind of unit you're going to want to get early and set up things in defense. For example, if you want to set up the fortifications here that you might historically have, right? Over by Monte Cassino, you're going to have to do that well in advance, and the game is not going to guide you towards doing it. You're going to have to spend so much money, it costs more than a special forces to get these engineers, and then go set that up in advance. And they are not strong. Aside from setting up defenses, they're not going to have a lot of other uses. So the earlier you get one, kind of the better, but also their usage is very limited, and you're maybe better off not relying on them very much either, because potentially fortifications can also be turned against you, something to keep in mind. Then we have paratroops. These are what you'd expect, paratroopers. They can not move as well on land, but like special forces, they're very good at their own field. They are essentially corps repurposed to flying and dropping. They cost even more than a special forces, and you could generally get even less of them than you can special forces. They can be intercepted by enemy fighters, which is a concern, and they can have casualties upon landing, which special forces can as well. They can also miss their target of where they are dropping, but the ability to drop them in generally anywhere and then have them attack immediately that turn is still a pretty useful thing. It's a very specialized kind of core, and no nation can get a whole lot of them. However, those that can would be hard pressed to, or maybe well pressed to make the most of them. And that's really up to your strategic goals. They do not benefit from the ability that special forces have where they can keep supply for a long time even after landing, which makes them a little bit more vulnerable. They can land, attack, and move a little bit all in the same turn. However, they are going to need to land and take something for supply because they will adjust to that local supply the next turn. Next, we have cavalry. Cavalry were still a big thing in World War II, though they kind of sucked. And in this game, appropriately, they are very cheap in between a corps and a garrison, closer to a garrison. These are not very good units to be fighting with, honestly. Cavalry are a soft target, just like a garrison, so everything can generally hurt them a lot, and they can't hurt anything else very well. In my opinion, their main use is the fact that they are so mobile. They are as mobile as, say, a corps that has mobility, for example. They can be very mobile for a very cheap price. They're not as good as a dedicated recon unit in a recon role, but for a very cheap price, you have some pretty hyper mobile, like garrison plus units that can actually get up to full strength and serve some kind of supporting role in battle, chasing down fleeing enemies, attacking enemy garrisons and units that are already weak otherwise. They do have their purpose, especially for such a cheap price. I'd say overall they're probably more useful than engineers are, generally, especially for what you pay for them. But they can also be pretty easily avoided, just like engineers, because they're very specialized. They're not very versatile. Next up, we have anti-air. Anti-air is a very static unit. You find a place to put it, it will sit there, and if something is next to it by 1 hex, it will defend that unit from enemy air bombings. It will also defend nearby hexes in general. So defending, say, mines over in France, for example, and Belgium. It could defend those just well for a very cheap price, only 100 MPPs. For land units, that's already impressive. Once you see the prices on fighters and other planes, you're going to definitely see the purpose of this. Nations like China should definitely be getting these, because this is a much cheaper way to defend from enemy air attacks without maintaining a very expensive air force of your own, and generally you can get a decent amount of these. Very useful unit, still specialized, technically can be avoided by the wealthier nations, but still they have their place, and it's a very useful defensive place. Next up is artillery. Now there's a lot of different kinds of artillery. We don't even see all of them here. The main towed types are rocket artillery, heavy artillery, and field artillery. Heavy artillery is the one you'll see the most in every nation. If a nation has access to artillery, they probably have access to heavy artillery. Field artillery is a worse version of heavy artillery that is usually only available by event. And then rocket artillery is a slightly better version of heavy artillery that I think is only available to Germany. But these differences are really, really minimal in that I'm pretty sure they all come down to demoralization stats anyway. So you can generally use them as if they're one and the same. However, just note that that is how the hierarchy of towed artillery works. Rocket is the best, then heavy, and then field. These are great defensive units. If you put them next to any unit, then if that unit in front gets attacked, then the artillery will fire defensive fire that will then consume ammo, but reduce the effectiveness of an enemy attack on whatever unit that it was set to attack. So very useful defensive unit. They can also be used offensively, which is useful, but they're very slow. So using them in narrow mountain hallways or places that don't see a lot of movement anyway could be useful, but then they're also more impeded by movement impeding things like mountains and low supply areas. The main thing is that defensively, they're very important for locations that need to be statically held. However, they're not very available because from what I've read, the devs considered it more of a World War I era thing to touch upon. And they kind of compete with tactical bombers, which we'll get to in a bit. However, tactical bombers are way more expensive and they need fighters to support them. Artillery does not. They just need to not force march all over the place so that they retain their ammo and they're limited by that ammo. But they also can't be intercepted, kind of like anti-air can't be intercepted when it defends something. However, fighters can end up having to fight enemy units, which again, we'll talk about in a little bit. Very useful defensive unit, can be used offensively. If you have access to them, you might want to consider using them, especially in more static and less progressive fronts that don't move as much. They're very useful. There is also a railgun. This is also an artillery unit. It's the same exact thing pretty much. It has like the least demoralization out of all of them, as you can see, but it has more action points because it can move farther. However, that farther is entirely along rails, and you will see here it has pretty good resource damage, but it's not as good at other kinds of damage. You'll notice that de-entrenchment right here. This is for lowering the entrenchment of entrenched units. So this is that attack value, for example. You need that if you're going to go on the attack. That's something that attacking in general repeatedly is good for, or using tactical bombers. A railgun can't de-entrench anything, but it can bring some damage to resources pretty well, which is good for lowering supply on a hex. So that is kind of useful. It's a different kind of artillery. They're all good at different things. I will note, despite me calling rocket artillery the best, it doesn't do as much resource damage on the offense, but you don't usually use artillery to lower resources, and that just means supply. Like this produces 10 supply, it has 10 strength. You would have to hit this with 10 resource damage to lower that to 0, and then it would work its way up by 1 every turn again. You don't usually use artillery for this because it would require so much artillery to make any kind of important effect there. And generally, if you're going to be going for that, you're going to be hitting it from afar with like a strategic bomber, which we'll get to in a bit. But we can actually touch upon that right now because the next thing is rockets, which is another kind of artillery, sort of, although this one just completely forgoes any usefulness against enemy units, because If you're using rockets, these are Germany only. You're only going to be using them in a strategic capacity. So for example, shooting across here at London or anywhere that produces supply and MPPs to reduce the MPPs and supply of the opponents there. If you could hit the mines at Cardiff too, that's an example. This sort of strategic targeting is very useful for countering the income of an enemy. And usually you're going to use this with rockets or strategic bombers, which is why I say the ability of that for artillery is kind of pointless because they can only hit one hex out anyway, a hex that you're probably going to take over pretty soon anyway. So, but that's what rockets are. Rockets are unique. They are useful like strategic bombers. Their range goes up over time with research. Other artillery does not. So that makes them a little more useful in that capacity, though they can't move very much. Then we have armored trains, and this is technically a light armor. It is considered, you know, a bad tank, but unlike mechanized units, and light armor in this capacity does use infantry weapons, by the way, like infantry technology to get better. Not all of them do that, like light tanks don't, but we'll get to that when we get to that. An armored train does not get that second attack. It can move very far, but it can only move on a train track, just like a railgun. It's pretty good at attacking and then still moving because there's just so much AP. Doesn't really have that much of a zone of control like mechanized. It's a good like hit and run sort of unit, but if you look at its attack values by default, they're pretty bad. They're pretty bad. This thing isn't even that useful against garrisons. It's another unit that's better at chasing things down. It's not that strong, it's just versatile. It's got like that mobility, but even more than cavalry. But again, still just on rails only, so its usefulness is limited. However, if you can have one, there's not a lot of harm in having one. 200 MPPs means it's the same price as an engineer, and you can at least kill some enemy units with it, unlike engineers, which are more to prevent your own deaths, but they require so much foresight and thinking ahead, and putting aside things that would help you in combat anyway, that I would say an armored train is probably a better thing to look at. Anti-tank, another 200 MPP unit, counts as a light armor, which I find so funny, but this is the armor counter defensively. Look how much damage it does to tanks and light armor. If any tank light armor, that includes mechanized, and that includes these armored trains, for example, then an anti-tank can fuck them up in defensive locations. Even in offensive locations, if you move them forward, it's just hard to get them in that position because they don't move very much. They do have a full zone of control to stop enemy units from passing through, however, so they are useful. They have their own research category dedicated to them, however, cheaper than other ones, but still pretty expensive. So if you're gonna use these, you're either gonna use them as like tank, like anti-tank garrisons, or you're gonna really need to specialize in researching in making them better. Next up, we have tanks. Tanks, these are your definitive standardized armor units, full zone of control, great movement range, ability to become more mobile, upgraded against enemies that it fights normally, as well as against air units for defense. It can strike twice with proper research, great demoralization. This kind of unit is the kind of unit that you destroy everything that does not have anti-tank capabilities with. It is not the best for going after units in, say, cities, but breaking through defensive lines and then maneuvering past and around them, trying to break your opponent's front lines. This is amazing for that, and it's amazing at dealing damage in more open terrains in general. This is a very useful unit that goes off of the advanced tanks upgrade, like research line. It is very useful. If you have it, you can probably, if you've invested into it enough, and only a couple nations really have the money to do that, for example, Germany, the USSR, can definitely do it. If you invest heavily enough into these, they can make quick work of even an elite core army focused army for the price of an army too. Now, unupgraded, they're not all that great, but they can become amazing. Don't put everything into them because, as you see, your numbers are quite limited. But they do have a bigger brother, the heavy tank. Now, this becomes available at a different point of time for every nation that is capable of getting it. These are just tanks, but better. They are slightly slower, as you might expect with like a corps to an army. Look at those stats on the side. They are extra demoralizing. Infantry already flee at the sight of tanks. Imagine a heavy tank. You know, you're going from like a Panzer III to a Tiger. Just like that. Their defensive values are, of course, higher. Still full zone of control. And just overall, it's just going to be the same thing, but better. It's the same target type, just a little slower. These are even better, but of course, they're also pretty limited. Germany doesn't get them until the end of 1941, early 1942, and Japan doesn't get them until January of 1944, and with greater limits. So make the most of these if you get them, and honestly, probably don't even go into these unless you're already researching heavily into tanks to begin with, because they're very expensive. 300 MPPs for one? That's more than an army. That's more than a tank. That competes with ships. I mean, look at it. It's more expensive than a battle cruiser and just less expensive than a battleship and a carrier. That's the realm that you are competing in when you go for heavy tanks, so be wary of those. To step back a little bit, we also have light tanks. Now, these are not just tanks, but worse. They are tanks, but way fucking worse. It's not just a step up, like step down. It's a step up and then fall down the stairs, basically. If you look at those stats on the right there that are changing, you'll notice there's a much bigger difference. They have no demoralization capacity whatsoever. They have no de-entrenchment. They are not any faster than normal tanks. Their stats are worse around the board. And they're not even the tank target type. They are light armor, just like some earlier things we looked at, such as the armored train. This is light armor, and this is essentially representing, according to the manual, outdated tank technologies. So, light tanks are not great, and if you can avoid them, you should. However, if you want something that is cheaper than a tank, to fill in potentially less important areas because you've hit the tank cap for whatever country you're playing, then this is how you can squeeze out a couple more things like that. If you know the mechanized you can get isn't quite enough, this one is actually still more of a tank. It's just also kind of weak. So there's that. It's even cheaper than mechanized too, which is hilarious. Quick scenery change, guys. It's come to my attention post-recording that there's one unit type that is simply not in the unit list for seemingly any country to build, and that is the Recon unit. For some reason, it seems like no one can build this, but this is, well, it's what it sounds like. It's a Recon unit. It's based on infantry weapons, has a defense mobility. You get these, I guess, exclusively out of events and starting situations, and they can be used to maneuver around places. They have very good mobility, even in pretty rough terrain. They do count as a light armor type, which we have gone over in this video. Very weak zone of control. Their fighting stats are pretty bad, but you can upgrade it with infantry weapons. This is mostly for survivability, however, because this mostly exists to recon. You'll see here they have a spotting land range of 3. That is further than your standard units would be doing, which is why I kind of would have compared this to the Cavalry during the initial recording. Unfortunately, yeah, it seems like you just can't build these. They're not even on the Allies side. I just came here to the end of my really old Allies series to check, and it's not here. So these are from events. Use them wisely, because it seems you can't get any more of them once they die. All right, back to the actual recording. Moving right along, we start getting into planes. Planes are extremely fucking expensive, not just to make, but to repair whenever they get damaged, and they'll get damaged a lot when you use them. This is the rich man's army right here, is the Air Force. Your fighter is your standard, most necessary air unit. Not only can you use this to go fight enemy planes, but if you have it in an area, which I'm sure we could take a look at here, this fighter, then it'll actually protect that area. It can even, go back into it here, assist other planes in their missions, their bombing missions, and protect them, as well as protecting your own cities and units. etc. They only advance off of advanced fighters and long-range aircraft. All the aircraft and paratroopers share long-range aircraft, so that's a pretty good one to get. Advanced fighters is specifically for fighters, so if you do go into it, you know, it's going to be expensive. But fighters are the first air-based units that you should be getting. Heck, you might not even want paratroopers before you have fighters, cheaper or not. Paratroopers can fly in and get intercepted by enemy fighters. They can be protected by your own fighters. So I would suggest having fighters first and foremost, because these alone are expensive enough to maintain, especially when you start throwing in other aircraft. For example, the tactical bomber, which is not $250, it is $300. That is even more expensive. The tactical bomber is astounding. Remember what we talked about with artillery and how it could be used offensively, but is mostly defensive? Well, this is the exact opposite. It really can't be used defensively to automatically respond to something, but you get a couple of these, even just one of them, attacking ground targets, and you'll have some great effect. Demoralization guaranteed here. And I have had de-entrenchment, even though this hasn't been showing it right here. They are amazing, again, against land targets specifically. This is your bomber dedicated to land targets, but they can also go after naval ships. They are just not as good at it as other bomber types. These ones are generally the worst at it if you don't include strategic bombers, which should not be ranked with tactical, medium, and maritime bombers. That's kind of the pendulum. The scale from land to sea is tactical, medium, maritime. Strategic's kind of in its own area. They use ground attack weapons primarily, and this is shared with other kinds of bombers, so they're a little bit more accessible despite being quite expensive. You should not really be operating this or much of any other kind of bomber without some access to fighter protection. Maritime may be an exception, but we'll get to that when we get to that. Moving on to medium bombers. These are a cross between tactical bombers and maritime bombers. They are just as expensive as a tactical bomber is. They are just not quite as good. You see, they start out like a point behind and they start needing upgrades to really keep up there. They are much better at demoralization and have more guaranteed de-entrenchment here, as you can see. They come with a little bit better range by default, and their capacity to fight naval units thus ends up being better than tactical bombers, even though they kind of play in the same ballpark. They also manage a bit more in the way of resource damage. Resource damage, as I mentioned, is still primarily best left to strategic bombers and to rockets, really. Moving to strategic bombers, this is not for killing units. It is the most expensive kind of bomber at $350. One of these costs as much as a battleship, as much as a carrier. And just think about the costs of reinforcing it if it ever takes any damage. That's very expensive, especially compared to rockets, which can serve the same role at a lower range. And it as well has its own dedicated research line. Heavy bombers while also taking from the long-range aircraft. It can hurt land units, but it can't really upgrade that capacity, and it's always going to try to attack the hex itself before it attacks any units on top of it. They can get 2 strikes, and they do have some demoralization, but their main thing is this resource attack, and this is what they buff. This is for lowering the supply, the strength, the income of certain hexes. Amazing for long-range striking enemy mines, oil fields, what have you. These are rockets, but with much, much longer range, but for a much, much higher price. Whereas rockets, for example, can fire and not take any damage the whole time. Strategic bombers are going to need fighters to escort them, and they are going to take damage, and you will be paying a lot of money to really use them. So if you're going to invest into them, which you don't really have to, but you can, you better be ready to pay the price and to defend them, because whatever goal you've set for them, they could get damaged doing it. I would recommend using them in locations where you know that your enemy does not have any anti-air defenses to maximize damage for as little cost as possible. Otherwise, use it to support invasions. For example, like the invasion of Malta, where it can lower the enemy supply and strength here, to make it so that the enemy can no longer repair there, helping you pull off an amphibious invasion. Now, maritime bombers are the cheapest planes there are. Only 150, that's cheaper than rockets. That's the cheapest. This is the price of a core. These are so accessible, except for the fact that the build limits on them are very small. No matter who you're playing as, really, you can't usually get a lot of these. Maritime bombers are your ASW and anti-ship planes. So these are the only ones that really have dedicated ASW. There's a ship that has planes that has them, and we'll get to that. But if you want ASW out of your planes, you need to go maritime, which is good because they're so cheap. But they're also really, truly the best at striking enemies that are at sea, and they have the range to pull it off as well. And they're so cheap that they don't even necessarily need fighter support. You could just have maritime bombers and no fighters. For example, it may not be too wise to try to use maritime bombers to strike things in the strait where there's fighters nearby, but if you have fighters as well, then okay. However, if we're looking at, say, a bunch of Pacific Islands, you could use maritime bombers, use their excessive sight range as kind of a way to keep an eye on the area as like patrol units, and bombing any stray ships or transports that might be going through unguarded by enemy carriers. For example, this is a great way to use maritime bombers, and being that they're so cheap, they're very accessible, but their usage is also so niche and maybe not even necessary if you have a strong enough land force somewhere that it is up to you, really, if you actually invest into these at all. The fact that they draw from the same naval weaponry that every other bomber draws from for attacking ships, and from ASW that every single ship uses as a defense against submarines, and as an offense in some cases, makes them exceptionally accessible, especially, again, with that price, if you do wish to include them in your strategies once you find the correct time to. Next is a Japan-only unit. This starts way late in the war, January 1st, same as those heavy tanks, 1944. This is pretty late in the war. They cost only 75 MPPs. These things are insane, and they have quite a long operational range. It is what it sounds like. This is a plane whose only purpose is to crash into something. As a result, they actually draw from naval weaponry. There is also the ability to draw from ground attack weapons if you really want to put that on them. You'll note research is very cheap for these things, but if I was you, I would just decide what the idea of this plane is from the get-go, because you are building this to throw it at something and then it's dead. You can have like 6 of them, right? They're amazing at taking out enemy ships. You build a couple of these for the price of a single core, maybe dump some really, really cheap naval weaponry and long range, maybe upgrades on it to give it that range. And then you don't even really need fighter support. For the price of just a single core, unupgraded, you could easily take out an enemy carrier, battleship, just something very expensive, something that can take over a year in game to build, and you can pump these out one at a time or all at once, and they come out in 2 turns. They have a production delay of just 1 turn, meaning they come out in 2 turns. That's crazy. That's a lot of firepower that you could pull out of nowhere that costs virtually nothing. Only Japan gets them, and they only get them in 1944. So that's when the situation should be pretty desperate. Or if it's not desperate yet, it could still be very, very useful for wiping out American ships, for example. Speaking of ships, let's get on to the ships. So let's look at battleships. Battleships, the kings of the ocean, or they were. These guys are great at bombarding locations to demoralize anybody on there and do some resource damage. However, be careful bombarding because you can take damage in return fire, even if you don't see anything that might return fire. They pull off of naval weaponry, anti-air, ASW, all very accessible things, and you'll find most ships pull off this stuff as well. They are the same price as carriers, which is a little strange because in reality, a carrier would actually be a lot cheaper at this time, but the carrier is probably also reflecting all the aircraft that go on it in the price. These things are great at fighting other ships. Any ship smaller than them is going to get slaughtered by them, and they are the only real options in ship-to-ship engagements for fighting other battleships. If we look over here at Germany, we have battle cruisers. Battle cruisers at this time were sort of a leftover of something that no longer qualified as a battleship, but probably used to, that attempted to be something more than a heavy cruiser. And because of that, this is a lot more like a battleship in its stats as you look than it is similar to a heavy cruiser. It is not nearly as much money as a battleship, which makes it a little more accessible to build or have these than full-on battleships. However, again, battle cruisers in their inception, these were designed to be heavy cruiser killers, you know? Again, great at killing everything below them and fighting each other. But a battleship will slaughter these. Same thing with heavy cruisers. These are cheaper than battle cruisers, certainly, and they're not going to do anything great in bombardment at all at this point. They're meant for fighting other ships. Heavy cruisers were meant for killing things smaller than heavy cruisers. You see how the Navy works? And they're great for fighting each other. And we can't forget about light cruisers, which are slightly cheaper than heavy cruisers, and as you can see in the stats, are slightly worse. Not even any demoralization. These ones essentially exist for screening purposes and to kill destroyers. This is even cheaper. These are great as escorts. You know, they're great for protecting other ships from submarines and protecting convoy lines from submarines. However, don't mistake this for being good against submarines on the offense. Submarines are kind of trap units, which we'll talk about in a moment, but so are destroyers in a way. These are the trap springers. They have a very high sub defense value, but a very low sub attack value. Resultingly, they're great for just sailing into a sub and springing its trap and letting the sub attack it, because they're going to deal amazing fire in return with its depth charges. Any other ship bigger than it is going to slaughter it. This is a much cheaper, you know, almost core priced throwaway sort of escort unit that you can usually make in bulk. Well, you're ideally not throwing it away. It still takes a little over half a year to make one. Look at these costs to make any. With ships, you really have to plan in advance for when you need them. All the ones that are super useful for big naval operations take over a year to build. None of them take quite 2 years to build, but carriers get pretty close at 19 months to pump out one, which is crazy. Now, carriers are different because they actually draw from advanced fighters right here, as you can see. They're their own target type. Their fighters are what's on board, meaning that these are fighters. These are not bombers. These fighters are, however, pretty darn decent at attacking other ships. And they can be made better against enemy planes as well, which is useful. They'll draw from the naval weaponry tech, as you see, to buff their attack against ships. So carrier fighters are actually a mixture of fighters and maritime bombers. They do take a little bit of micromanagement. If we find a carrier here, you have to actually set the mode, fighters, bombers, or mix. Never use mix because it's literally splitting them half and half, which means if you do need to run the fighters, they're going to be at half strength. And if you do need to run the bombers, they're going to be at half strength. So just pick one. Have multiple carriers ideally and just pick one. Or provide fighter support in some other way, ideally, right? That's the way I would handle this if I was you. Carriers are pretty weak as ships, so you're always going to want to keep them protected by some screens. The stronger the screen, the better, though bringing battleships with them is a little risky, as a carrier and a battleship is sort of the head honcho, the flagship of the fleet. At the very least, even a battleship fleet could do with having a carrier for air protection from its fighters, even if the carriers are not the main focus of the fleet. There are also escort carriers. As you see, I'm switching back and forth. Not every unit gets everything. Escort carriers are way cheaper than battleships or even carriers. They're for escorts. Maybe more you might think for this role, but not exactly. Really, if you compare the two here, you'll see the main thing that an escort carrier has over a carrier is the fact that it has ASW, but it does not have naval weaponry, meaning this is kind of the same thing. It's like a hybrid between a fighter and a maritime bomber, except the carrier got the maritime bomber's ability to go after surface ships, and the escort carrier got the ASW capacity. It can work as a literal fighter escort if you need cheap protection with advanced fighters from enemy aircraft. This probably fits that role a lot better than the fighter. It just won't be able to ever really fight back against enemy ships, but it will be able to also help you with some ASW capabilities. It's a lot cheaper. It's a lot cheaper. $350, $150. You can get 2 escort carriers for the price of one of these carriers, and then still have money left over for a fucking garrison. That's incredible. These are very useful if you have access to them, but make sure you use them right. They are here to protect, not to attack. Next, though, we have subs. Subs, as I mentioned, are trap units. Their defensive values are not very high, but their offensive values are high. Mostly their offensive values are high if they trigger an ambush. So for example, if I have a ship, I have this little ship right here, right? If a submarine walks up into it and attacks it, it could do some damage, sure. And this battlecruiser is not very likely to do much back. A destroyer will. But this battlecruiser, not so much. However, if I have a sub and it's just chilling, and then a battlecruiser, enemy battlecruiser, tries to go past that area, they're going to trigger an ambush by the sub, which is going to vastly increase the damage that sub does to the enemy ship. Against most ships, this is amazing. Against destroyers, that's the trap. You might do a lot of damage, but it's going to do a lot of damage to you. And a destroyer is cheaper than a submarine. And it has way more versatility to what it can be used for as well. All surface ships and subs can be used for raiding convoy lines. Hunt is the raid mode for subs. Subs will do it better. Subs will do more damage. Hell, even maritime bombers can raid these. And to some extent, there's always some sort of national morale hit from raiding as well, as just taking MPPs away from your enemies. Subs are nice because if they do start taking damage or risk it, they'll actually dive and move away a little bit and try to escape. They can take damage in this process, but this makes them way more survivable than any other ship that you could send to do raiding, where if a lone, for example, started Germany, if a lone heavy cruiser gets caught out in the ocean doing some raiding by 2 ships or more, like 2 heavy cruisers of the enemies or bigger, that thing's dead. Whereas most of the ships in the game really can't touch a sub, especially early on. Only those really specialized ones, like escort carriers and destroyers. But the destroyer needs you to come to it. One ship that can hurt a sub quite well is a motor torpedo boat. Only 75 MPPs. This is the same price as those kamikazes, and they do not die after they get used. They are not the ones you want running into submarines, because look at this. Only 1 sub defense, but they actually have a sub attack value that you can upgrade. They can be used against enemy ships as well, but even a destroyer could slaughter one of these. So ideally, you want to keep these out of that. Now, unfortunately, a motor torpedo boat is very short range. They move very slowly. So you have to take that into account when you use them. Whereas a destroyer, it can actually keep up with a fleet. It's designed to be that fast, moving more than 3 times as fast as a motor torpedo boat. Motor torpedo boats, these were designed to kind of just guard the coasts. They can't get very far, and if they get too far away, they can run out of supply and just get dead in the water, killed the first time any enemy ship runs into them. They are a good quick reaction force to local enemy submarine activity, and a decent enough hunting force if you have other quick reaction forces in the region to assist them should they encounter something out of their leagues. And if you do lose them, well, it's only 75 MPPs. Japan late game is going to be throwing that away on kamikazes like crazy. So it is what it is. And that's it. That is every unit in the game, a brief description about it put into layman's terms, and how I would recommend that you use them and what they can be used for. I hope this guide has been helpful to you. This is part of a playlist of guides that you can find in the description below. If you'd like to see more guides in this playlist, then feel free to leave your suggestions in the comments below, and if it's a good one, I'll make a guide on it. Otherwise, if you have any questions that I can answer more quickly, then I will respond to you in the comments below. But for now, thank you guys very much for watching, and I hope I'll see you on the next one.